All right, let's dive into this one. Illegal immigration to the United States. You guys sent in a lot on this, most of it based on that big Wikipedia article.
Yeah, it's a hot topic for sure. Lots of opinions, but
We're all about the facts here.
exactly. Sticking to what the sources say. And this one, it's fascinating.
Oh, I bet. Touches on everything, right?
Economy, law, social issues. It's like you look at America through this lens
So you
and,
see the whole picture.
in a way, yeah.
So to even start making sense of it, the source breaks down the different types of foreign-born people we have here. It's not as simple as just saying immigrant.
Nope, not at all. Naturalized citizen, documented non-citizen, undocumented, even people banned from entering. Whole different categories.
It's like a puzzle where the pieces keep changing,
Hmm.
and then you throw in the terms illegal versus undocumented.
Oh, yeah. Those get used interchangeably sometimes, but
They don't always mean the same thing, right?
it's almost like the words themselves are part of the debate. Like,
Mhm.
are we talking law, human rights, something else? It's all tangled up.
Okay, so it's complicated already. We haven't even gotten to history. The source takes us back to the 1800s when things were apparently a lot more, uh,
Relaxed.
yeah, relaxed at the border.
It's wild to think about now, but back then, only like 1% of people trying to get into the U.S. were turned away. Mainly if they were sick or something.
But then as we get into the 20th century, the U.S. starts getting a lot more particular about who they let in, right?
Big time.
So the source mentions stuff like the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, then later the Immigration Act of 1924. Were those part of that
A
shift?
huge part of it. Those laws were about setting limits, often based on where someone was from, their ethnicity, totally reshaped who could come to America.
And it's like those anxieties about who's desirable and who isn't. It's not like those just vanish, right? Feels like we're still dealing with that today.
Oh, absolutely. Those policies from back then, they're woven into the fabric of the U.S.
Yeah.
Like they explain part of why this whole immigration debate is so charged even now.
Okay, so fast forward to today. The source talks about how the landscape of illegal immigration is changing, and one of the big things is who's coming to the U.S.
Yeah, so for the longest time, we think of illegal immigration, we think of Mexico.
Okay.
Right? And for a while, that was true. Most undocumented folks were from there. But lately, that's been shifting.
So the picture we have in our heads of someone crossing the U.S.-Mexico border.
It's not the whole story anymore. Not even close.
So where are people coming from now?
More and more are coming from Central America and Asia, too. And then there's the whole visa overstay thing.
Right, where someone comes in legally, but then...
They just don't leave when they're supposed to. Could be even more common than those actual border crossings these days.
But speaking of border crossings, the source uses this term, got away. Sounds a little scary. What is that exactly?
So picture this. Someone's detected crossing, maybe even chased by Border Patrol, but they still managed to get away. Vanished.
Into the landscape.
Exactly. Those are the gotaways. Kind of highlights how even with all the tech and resources, it's still really hard to totally secure the border.
Makes you think. And speaking of challenges, there was that whole surge of unaccompanied minors a few years back, 2011 to 2016. Thousands of kids, mainly from Central America, showing up at the border alone. That must have been a mess, logistically and just, humanely.
Oh, it was a crisis for sure. Over 178,000 unaccompanied minors apprehended in that period. And the law, it gets really tricky. There's the William Wilberforce Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act, which is meant to protect kids who are victims of trafficking. But how do you apply that to this kind of mass influx? It was tough.
So many moving parts. And then can't forget the whole family separation policy in 2018.
Yeah, that was a dark time. The intent, I guess, was to deter migration, but separating kids from their families at the border, it just caused so much trauma. Got condemned pretty much across the board. It really shows you the human impact these policy decisions have.
All right, so we've got who's coming, how they're getting here. But the big question is why? Why would someone risk everything to come to the U.S. illegally?
The million-dollar question, right? And it's not simple. The source lays out a bunch of factors. Economics is huge, obviously. I mean, in a lot of countries, the wage gap between what you can earn at home versus in the U.S., it's massive.
Yeah, they even mentioned this study about migrant workers during the Oregon harvest season. They were making 6 times what they could back home. And even after travel costs and all that, they were still making 3 times more.
That's life-changing money.
Yeah.
Especially when you're facing poverty back home or just limited opportunities. But often it's not even just about the individual. It's about family, too. Sending money back to support loved ones.
So one person's journey actually impacts a whole network of people.
Exactly.
But it's not always about the money, right? The source talks about how sometimes it's about safety.
Right. Fleeing violence or political instability.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's straight up survival. Makes you think about what we consider desirable and how that changes depending on where you're standing. For some folks, it might be a high-paying job, but for others, it's just basic safety and stability.
Exactly. And then on top of all that, there's the whole issue of legal pathways to immigration. The source talks about how there are limited options, especially for folks without some special skills or degrees. They even mentioned the Bracero program, which brought in Mexican workers during World War II, but then it ended.
And some argue that that actually contributed to the rise in illegal immigration because people still needed work, but the legal ways to get here were closed off.
So it's like this catch-22, they need work, we need workers, but the system makes it near impossible. What happens to folks once they're here? Especially when it comes to finding work, the source talks about that.
Yeah, so for undocumented immigrants, finding work, it's often about survival, not getting the best deal. They're vulnerable to exploitation because they lack legal protections. So an employer can take advantage of that, pay low wages, no benefits, even dangerous working conditions. And if you're undocumented, scared of being deported, are you really going to complain about being underpaid or working a risky job? You just got to keep your head down.
Makes sense, sadly. It's survival.
And it doesn't stop at work.
Yeah.
That lack of legal status, it affects almost everything. Healthcare, education, even getting access to help if they need it, creates this cycle of vulnerability, makes it so much harder to improve their situation.
It's like they're contributing to the economy, but then...
But they're denied basic services and protections.
Yeah.
Almost like the system itself is designed to keep them in this precarious spot.
Yeah. And that brings us to the whole question of law enforcement, right? How the U.S. actually deals with illegal immigration, which I have a feeling...
Oh yeah, that's a whole other can of worms. Where do you even begin? It's a mess, especially when you look at who's in charge of what. The source talks about this constant back and forth between the feds and individual states.
So like a family arguing over chores,
Well,
but...
with immigration laws.
Exactly.
And then you add in detention and deportation. That whole system, it's huge EE.
I bet.
The source says on any given day, we're talking thousands of people held in immigration detention centers. And deportations, those have gone way up since the 90s.
Seriously. Like by how much?
Well, just between 2003 and 2008, they increased over 60%.
Wow, cracking down, huh?
Yeah. Definitely seems like stricter enforcement, more border security focus, and then you've got the whole sanctuary city thing.
Right. I've heard that term, but what does it actually mean?
Think of it like this. These cities are basically saying, we're not going to work with ICE. They limit how much they cooperate with federal immigration enforcement. Sometimes they even refuse to hold undocumented folks for ICE.
Seems almost rebellious, like they're defying the government.
In a way, yeah. Their argument is it makes things safer for everyone, documented or not. Like if immigrants aren't terrified of being deported, they're more likely to report crimes, work with the police.
I can see how that'd be controversial, though. Some people probably see it as undermining the law.
Oh, for sure. It's a huge debate. The source mentions research going both ways, too. Some studies say sanctuary cities actually have lower crime rates, while others say there's no real effect either way.
Huh. So it's still up in the air, but what about the military? Sometimes they get involved in border control, which seems... Yeah, a little bit.
Source mentions it's happened a few times throughout history, but not always effective. There was even this tragic incident back in '97. American citizen Ezequiel Hernandez Jr., he was shot and killed by Marines patrolling the border.
Oh, wow.
Sparked a lot of debate about whether militarizing the border is the right move at all. Shows you the risks,
Yes.
Things can go wrong, really wrong.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got the history, who's coming, why they're coming, the challenges they face, how the U.S. tries to manage it all. But I feel like there's a big elephant in the room here.
Economics.
Economics. Everyone's got an opinion, but what does the research actually say about the impact of illegal immigration on, the economy?
That's where it gets interesting. The source cites some studies that really challenge the common narrative. Like, a lot of research has found that undocumented immigrants actually contribute to economic growth. They make the U.S. economy bigger, help keep prices lower for everyone.
That's not what you usually hear, though. It's usually about how they're taking jobs, draining resources.
Right, but it's more complicated than that. There's this economist, Giovanni Pieri. He did a study that found between 1990 and 2004, immigrant workers, including undocumented ones, they actually boosted the wages of native-born workers overall. But it's not that simple. His research also showed the newer immigrants often push down the wages of those who had immigrated earlier, so there's competition within those communities, too.
So like a ripple effect. It's not just one straight line.
Exactly. And then there's the impact on government spending, which everyone loves to argue about.
Big debate.
The source points out that undocumented immigrants, they pay taxes, same as anyone else, but they're not eligible for most federal benefits. So some researchers are like, hey, that's a net positive for the U.S. economy. They're putting in more than they take out.
They're paying in but can't benefit. Seems a little unfair.
Yeah, it's definitely a sticking point. The source even says they contribute an estimated $12 billion a year to the Social Security Trust Fund, but they can't collect any of it themselves.
Makes you wonder how the system could be, I don't know, restructured to make it more even.
It's a valid question, for sure.
Uh,
But shifting gears a bit, another big concern with illegal immigration is crime. The source actually addresses that head on, and you might be surprised by what the research says.
okay, I'm intrigued. Lay it on me.
So multiple studies have shown undocumented immigrants are actually less likely to commit crimes than native-born citizens. Like one study from 2016, it found no link between undocumented populations and violent crime, though there was a small association with drug offenses. But that's it. Kind of challenges the idea that they're making communities less safe.
That's kind of the opposite of what you usually hear.
That is. And the source also touches on those sanctuary cities and crime rates. A review of several studies found they either have no impact or might even lower crime.
So potentially safer. That's wild.
It all gets tied into things like community trust and law enforcement, too. If people feel comfortable reporting crimes without being deported, they're more likely to cooperate with police, which can lead to lower crime overall. The source even says that stricter immigration enforcement might actually make things worse when it comes to safety.
How so?
Well, think about it. If undocumented folks are constantly afraid of being deported, they're not going to report crimes. They're not going to work with the police. That creates fear, distrust, and that helps criminals operate more easily.
Like a domino effect.
Exactly. And that's true for economic stuff, too. The source mentions how stricter border control can actually make it more likely that undocumented immigrants will settle here permanently.
I wouldn't have thought of that.
Well, think of it like this. If it's too risky and expensive to go back and forth for seasonal work, they might decide it's safer and cheaper to just stay in the U.S. long term, even bring their families over.
So it's like they're forced to choose between family separation or taking this huge risk by staying here illegally.
Exactly. And speaking of tough situations, the source also goes into the whole issue of education for undocumented immigrants.
Right. What's the story there?
It's mixed. So on the one hand, when it comes to college, it's tough. Getting financial aid, forget about it. They're often ineligible for federal grants or loans.
Makes sense, I guess. But
Yeah.
they're entitled to at least, basic education, right?
Thankfully, yeah. There's that Plyler versus Doe ruling from 1982. It guarantees K-12 education for all students, no matter their immigration status. So at least those kids can get an education.
That's good to hear. But what happens when they turn 18?
That's when it gets messy. They lose those protections they had as minors, and suddenly they're subject to the full force of immigration enforcement.
So they could be deported just because they got older? Seems rough.
It is. These dreamers, they grew up here, went to school here, this is their home, but they can be taken away from it all just because of their birthday. There's been attempts to create a path to citizenship for them, like the DREAM Act, but it's a political battle, for sure.
So much uncertainty for them. But even with all that, I imagine there are still reasons why someone would choose to come here illegally.
Absolutely. The source talks about how for a lot of people, it's a simple calculation. Risk versus reward.
What do you mean?
Like, imagine you're in a country where there's no opportunities, maybe even violence or persecution. The risk of staying might seem even greater than the risk of making this dangerous journey to a place where you might have a chance at a better life.
So even a small chance is worth it. But we've talked a lot about the challenges, the risks. What about the human cost? Like, what does the source say about what it's actually like for people going through this?
Oh, it doesn't shy away from that. Talks about the dangers of crossing illegally, dehydration, the weather, even running into dangerous animals. And sadly, lots of people die each year trying to make that journey.
It's easy to forget with all the politics and numbers that we're talking about real people risking their lives.
And even if they make it across, the challenges don't stop.
Hmm.
The source talks about how undocumented immigrants are often vulnerable to exploitation by employers, long hours for little pay, dangerous conditions. And because they're undocumented, they might not even report it. They're afraid of being deported.
Yeah.
Creates this cycle that's hard to break free from.
Yeah, stuck.
And the health disparities. Often they don't have access to affordable health care, so they end up with untreated conditions. just worse health overall.
Tough situation all around. You're working hard, often in physically demanding jobs, but you can't even get the medical help you need.
It gets even darker when you consider human trafficking. The source cites research that suggests a good chunk of undocumented immigrants, especially from Mexico, they're trafficked by smugglers, by employers, forced into labor or sexual exploitation.
That's awful. They're already vulnerable, and then they become victims of these crimes. What does the source say about how the U.S. is dealing with that?
Well, there's been growing criticism of ICE, immigration and customs enforcement. The source mentions concerns about conditions in those detention facilities, the family separations. It highlights a report by the U.S. Civil Rights Commission that called for investigations into labor abuses in private prisons that house undocumented immigrants.
Wait, labor abuses in prisons?
Yeah, the report alleges that detainees were forced to work for little or no pay. It's a system that, some argue, is built to profit off of detaining immigrants, even if it means exploiting them.
That's disturbing. And what about the kids? We talked about unaccompanied minors earlier, but they must be especially vulnerable.
Absolutely. The source specifically calls out wrongful detention. Like there's been cases where unaccompanied kids were incorrectly labeled as adults, put in adult prisons based on faulty age tests.
A kid separated from their family, locked up with adults. That's just, I can't even imagine.
It shows how important it is to have oversight, accountability within that whole enforcement system. Make sure the most vulnerable people aren't being mistreated.
So much to think about. This whole issue has so many implications. But we've been super focused on the ground level. What about the bigger picture? How does this all play out in, like, popular culture?
Oh, that's a good question.
Mm.
The source does touch on that a bit, how illegal immigration has been explored in movies, documentaries, even music.
Makes sense. It's a story that resonates with so many people, both sides of the border. It's not just politics or economics, it's human.
Exactly. The source even specifically mentions this documentary series called How Democracy Works Now. It follows those efforts to pass comprehensive immigration reform back in the early 2000s.
So, like, a behind-the-scenes look at how those laws get made, the fights that happen.
Yeah, gives you some context for how complicated the debate is, how different groups are trying to influence things.
Okay, we have covered so much. History, economics, the dangers, challenges, even pop culture. It's a lot, but I feel like I actually understand this issue a lot better now.
That's the point, right? To get past the sound bites and the easy answers
Okay.
and actually dig into the nuance.
Absolutely. And it's clear there's no easy answers. But we can't just give up and say it's too complicated.
Nope, this is something that affects all of us, whether we realize it or not.
So where do we go from here? What can we even do about it? Like, as individuals, how do we actually engage with this in a meaningful way?
Well, I'm glad you asked. I think the first thing is awareness,
Yeah,
honestly. We threw a lot of info at you today, but
It's a deep dive.
it is. But it's just a starting point, right? Like, keep digging, read more, watch those documentaries, see what different folks are saying. Is like, we gave you a flashlight, but
You got to explore the cave yourself.
exactly. And once you've done some exploring, talk about it. Share what you've learned. Family, friends, coworkers, whoever. Get those conversations going because
It's funny. It's a SEH, a hot topic. But how often do we actually have good conversations about it? The calm, informed kind. It's all just shouting matches online or whatever.
exactly. That's why it's so important to actually talk, to listen to each other, even when we disagree. And that starts with challenging our own assumptions.
I think that's one of the best things about learning something new. It's like suddenly you have to see things from a different angle, maybe even question stuff you thought you knew for sure.
Exactly. Expanding our understanding, even if it gets a little uncomfortable. And remember, at the end of the day, this is about people, real people
Mm.
with real lives and stories. It's not just some abstract debate.
Easy to forget that with all these statistics and legal terms and everything, but these are people risking everything for a chance.
So when you're having those conversations, try to approach it with empathy. Be willing to see the complexity of it all.
And there's not always going to be a right answer, right? There's a lot of gray area here.
Tons of it.
Yeah.
It's about having that nuanced view, being open to different solutions.
Okay, so we've got being informed, having those tough conversations. Anything else we can do, like practically speaking, to make a difference?
Oh, for sure. You can support organizations that are out there helping undocumented immigrants. There are groups doing legal aid, healthcare, education, all that essential stuff.
So volunteering, donating, that kind of thing.
Makes a real difference.
Yeah.
And don't underestimate the power of getting political, too.
Yeah.
Contact your representatives. Let them know what you think about immigration. Support candidates who share your values.
Yeah, our voices actually do matter. We can make a difference by participating.
Even small actions add up. It's about being an informed citizen, using your voice to advocate for change.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Well, we've covered a lot in this deep dive, but like you said, it's just the beginning. It's up to all of us to keep learning, keep talking, and keep pushing for a better future for everyone.
I completely agree. Thanks for taking the time to dive into this with us.
Until next time, folks, stay curious.